Welcome to China in Context from the SOAS China Institute at the University of London. I'm Duncan Hewitt. The expansion of this year's Soccer World Cup finals has given an opportunity to many smaller football nations, with Cape Verde, Bosnia and Qatar all putting in creditable performances in their opening matches. Yet the extra qualifying slots have not helped several of the world's larger football-obsessed nations, most notably China, which failed to qualify for the finals. For a nation which previously played in the tournament in 2002 and whose women's team once reached a World Cup final, it's an embarrassment, particularly given the massive investment in the sport in China, which brought big-name foreign stars flocking to the Chinese Super League in the 2010s. At that time, President Xi Jinping famously expressed the hope that China would qualify for, host and eventually win the World Cup. In 2015, he even announced a 50-point football reform plan to promote the game all the way from the grassroots to the national team. Inspired by such political backing, Chinese investors started buying into major clubs in Europe, but many have now retreated amid an economic slowdown which hit many big Chinese companies. And last year, the latest in a series of corruption scandals to rock the game in China saw top clubs docked points and others demoted, the president of the country's football association sentenced to life in prison, and the former national team manager Li Tie, who once played in England for Everton, jailed for 20 years. And this year Chinese state TV only reached a deal to show the World Cup just a month before the competition began. So are China's traditionally passionate football fans falling out of love with the game? To discuss this, we're joined from Beijing by Rowan Simons, a media consultant and the chairman and founder of Club Football Beijing, which trains young players and runs a youth league in the Chinese capital. His experience of football in China goes back to the 1990s, when he first appeared as a pundit on the English Premier League for Beijing TV. And he's also the author of Bamboo Goalposts, a book about his quest to promote grassroots football in the country. Well, Rowan, thank you very much for joining us. So after all these problems, and with the national team not at the World Cup finals, are you seeing less public interest in the tournament in China this year?
No, I mean, I think the interest amongst the public for world-class football is absolutely the same as it's always been. They love their football. They follow the big five European leagues very, very closely, and every Champions League as well, UEFA Championships, and of course the World Cup. They absolutely love it and go crazy for it. People will be following it very avidly. This year's World Cup, of course, the timing is not great for China. Most of the matches are very late at night or early morning. But that won't diminish the interest. I think people will be following highlights packages throughout the day. Of course, social media makes it much easier for them to get up to date in real time. So yeah, there's always World Cup fever in China.
Because we did see this time that it was very late before CCTV, Chinese Central Television, and their parent company actually bought the rights to show the World Cup. And you know, some people wondered whether that was a sign that China was falling out of love with the tournament. But was it more good commercial sense and a bit of brinkmanship on their part to get the best deal
I think,
possible?
yeah, absolutely, that's the case. I mean, in the World Cup, of course, you've got the main sponsors, and they're looking for it to have maximum reach across the world. And in China, that still means CCTV on free-to-air TV. I think FIFA, probably like many of the rights holders, tried some of the social media or the internet companies to try and put in competitive bids. But in China, no one's going to bid against CCTV. So I think they just held their nerve until it came to the final stages, absolutely sure that FIFA would have to accept whatever deal they offered. So I think very smart commercial moves by CCTV, but obviously with the political backing to know that no one's going to go against them.
Because they then got a deal for, was it $60 million? And that was for two World Cups and a sort of men's and women's tournaments. And that's significantly less than many major European countries, for example, paid, I believe.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right. China has such a huge population, and I think if you look at previous World Cups and you look at the viewership figures, China is a massive part of that. So not to have China in it would be unacceptable for those main FIFA sponsors. So in the end, yeah, there was nowhere else to go. Certainly the regionals will not be bidding against them. I think CCTV will have now carved up the packages and pass it on to the internet companies. So they've certainly done extremely well out of this deal.
Obviously, China not actually being in the tournament does mean that presumably the enthusiasm that we saw in 2002 when China was in the finals in Korea and Japan is perhaps not quite at the same level. But we've seen a lot of talk on, in the Chinese media about things like the Chinese referee who is now refereeing at this tournament, and also obviously Chinese advertisers play a very significant role in World Cup sponsorship. We've also seen, China playing a big part in things like the infrastructure for, particularly in Mexico, where they've been building transport projects connected to the World Cup. So do Chinese people still feel quite connected to the World Cup, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, football is the global game, and China definitely respects excellence on the field. They follow the big players particularly. I mean, I noticed on there you can see the Mengniu yogurt adverts all in Chinese. So, I mean, that obviously is very well directed back at the audience here.
That's the big Chinese dairy product company, which is literally
Yeah.
translates as Mongolian cow.
Yes, exactly. And if I read it correctly, their billboard ad says something like, "If you don't like milk, try yogurt." I think there'll be a lot of CCTV reporters out there. There'll be a lot of KOLs on social media who are in the States and Mexico and Canada reporting live from the scene there. So,
Do you mean young Chinese influencers who have gone
yeah,
over just for the tournament?
absolutely. Yeah, we saw that particularly in the Russia World Cup in 2018. There was a very large number of people over there for tourism purposes, but also, for social media. So I think those are all ways in which it helps them connect. But at the end of the day, it's a global celebration, and China very much feels part of that, even though they're getting used to not having a team in the competition.
Obviously, we did see when Xi Jinping first became the leader in the early 2010s, a lot of talk coming from him and certainly from very high levels about China playing a major role in the future in World Cups, and he, I believe, enunciated this dream of China qualifying for and then hosting and then winning the World Cup. And in 2015, he set out, or his government set out, this extremely specific project for building up soccer, turning China into a global powerhouse, which would involve Chinese investment around the world. And we saw some of the Chinese tycoons getting involved. We saw Wanda, the huge real estate company from the Northeast, investing in Atletico Madrid. We then saw Suning, the Chinese electronics retailer, buying a controlling stake in Inter Milan. And together with all of the foreign players coming to China at that time because of the big money that was on offer, a lot of people, I think, assumed that this really would turn into something that just developed and snowballed. But that hasn't happened. What are the real reasons that didn't continue? We obviously saw things like corruption, we saw political issues, but what do you feel is sort of went wrong, as it were, with China's dreams of global dominance?
I mean, in the end, if you look at performance on the pitch as the final arbiter, China hasn't done enough to make football popular and buildings the pyramid with millions of kids at the bottom and a sort of a pathway for players to go through to the national team. That didn't happen. What we saw was a short-termist, opportunistic view from the tycoons that they could win political favor by investing into football. So that initially took sort of two directions. One, as you say, to go out and buy clubs around the world. That was also an easier way to get funds out of the country. Then the other way was spending big money on bringing top international players into China, which was also a way of getting money out of the country. Neither of those really had any impact at the grassroots, which is where China really needs to focus if it wants to build a sustainable football model. I think it all started to turn when it was realized how much money was leaving the country for football reasons. And so the state authorities made it known that they didn't like this sort of export of large amount of money. So that immediately put the kibosh on some of these big deals with foreign clubs. And then they introduced a wage cap. So they put, I think it was a limit of 5 million euros per annum for foreign player salaries. And obviously, if you're at the top level in the world, that's a very, very low level. Although the wage cap for Chinese players was still relatively high, for the big foreign players, that's just too low. So they disappeared. And then, of course, we had the COVID pandemic, which put paid to any kind of hosting of big international events, and also made visas very hard to get. So again, the exchange of players going in and teams going out to play kind of stopped. And then we had a huge corruption scandal, which tends to happen every 10 years or so. This one saw most of the senior officials at the Chinese Football Association going into prison for, sentences between 5 and 15 years. We saw Li Tie, the former international and China manager who played at Everton in his playing days. He went down.
He not only went down, but he went down for 20 years and
Yeah,
lost
yeah,
his appeal, right? And the
yeah,
Letier case seemed to be about taking bribes, both when he had been a club manager, but then also when he was the national manager, sort of around that COVID period. I think it was 2019 to
yeah,
21. And he'd taken
yeah.
something like $15 million in bribes, half of it while national team manager, apparently for things like picking players for his squads. I mean, it did seem extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean it went a bit further than that even that he ran a player agency which represented the players which he then picked for the national team. One of the things in China, even though they have a lot of censorship, is that football scandals tend not to be censored, and it is, all up there and out there, and people making a lot of claims that maybe were a bit spurious, but in the end, the counts that he was put away for show an incredible amount of corruption. I think one of the reasons that he got the national manager job because of his excellent performance in bringing teams up to the Super League. And then apparently all of those matches were fixed and he'd paid to do it. He paid off officials in order to get the position as the national team manager. And as I say, he had his own player agency, which then signed the players, which he then picked to come to the national team. So, yeah, these corruption scandals tend to come every 10 years or so, where it gets so bad that the government does a crackdown. And so we lost the entire leadership of the China Football Association and a number of senior officials in clubs, as well as players and referees. Everyone was involved. And, sort of anecdotally, we realize that the corruption is also an issue further down the grassroots pyramid, and that you hear stories of coaches who've paid the local football association to be appointed as the coach of the local junior representative teams, and they pay that money because then they can charge the parents to pick the kids. So it's really, terrible corruption all the way through the system, which is a total anathema to people like ourselves who sort of believe in football as a meritocracy. So I think, a combination of these factors all led to the end of the golden era. They called it the golden yuan era of football, and left us back where we started. I think over that period, probably the only actual real improvement was in the number of pitches. If you've got resources and there's a political will, there are plenty of people who are prepared to invest in building new pitches. So we see a lot more pitches now around the major cities and even some of the townships. But that's kind of the easy thing to do. It's much, much harder to build the culture and building the grassroots pyramid where those pitches are being used. It's been a much slower process to try and get people engaged in participating in the game. The other part of the football reforms, which were really excellent, in fact, is the 50 point football plan that was put out, 2015 football reform plan, and it all makes absolute sense. It started with a separation of the China Football Association from the government, which is actually part of the FIFA constitution. That hasn't been fully implemented, but it has in some ways been implemented.
So
Grassroots.
do you think the CFA are improving now after these latest round of scandals? Because as you say, in the past we've had lots of scandals, then reforms, and then as you mentioned, every 10 years or every decade or so, there's another one which suggests that the problem wasn't really rooted out.
Yeah, I mean the Chen Yuan, who was the chairman or president of the China Football Association, and a former leader of the Shanghai Port team, in his admission to the court, said that on the day he turned up, his first day at the China Football Association, a group came to see him with a large bag of cash, and they put the cash on the table, and he said, "Well, what do I have to do for that?" And they said, "Nothing. Just look after us," they say in Chinese, 多关注. just take care of us. And then 10 to 20 minutes later, another group came with another bag of cash. And so I think, yeah, the system was set up like that. And in the end, he accepted the cash and now he's gone away for a good, I think, 15 years. So the whole system around the game was tainted with this corruption. I think in the earlier corruption scandal, we saw again reports of referees receiving large bags of cash before the match started, and then which was replenished at half time.
I was just going to say, I remember interviewing an official from a club in southern China probably about 20 years ago, and he said exactly that. Both teams would bribe the referee just to make sure that he was fair.
Yes. So I think, these things are very hard to root out. Obviously, it all stopped when the government crackdown came. I think it probably went further than they'd anticipated. People were all carted off to a hotel in the north of China, and I think people more or less spilled the beans in order maybe to get a lenient sentence, and it went on and on and on and on. It was during the COVID period. I mean, again, it's a useful distraction, I think, to have these football scandals where are pretty open in the media. And
Because
so it's
the, cause,
cleaned up. We start
mm,
again, and then
mm.
we'll have to see whether or not it makes a difference this time. I mean, certainly the big foreign players are not coming anymore, so that's a large amount of money which is not being transferred out. That does mean that the league's more sustainable. There are still some foreign players coming, but not at the highest level. In Beijing Guoan, which is the major team here, have been quite vocal and public about their aims to become a sustainable organization within the next 3 years, and talking about some of the challenges they have in terms of the lack of revenue that the big foreign clubs get, in particular media rights, but also match day revenues are lower. In China, the clubs tend not to own their own stadiums. They're renting them from government stadiums, so that limits the amount of match day revenues you get. I think merchandising will be a lot less than we might see in other countries. So
But
it's a very
they
big
do,
challenge.
but they have traditionally had very big crowds. Some of these major clubs, Shanghai and Beijing, and places like Dalian and Guangzhou in the past.
Yeah, I was at a Beijing match a couple of months ago. It was pretty full. I think actually it was the biggest match attendance they'd had in the new stadium. It was just over 60,000. So, the ultras section is very vociferous. They're all there wearing the same outfits and with their flags waving and giving it a good. So, the atmosphere was very good. But when you go behind the stadium, you think of the way in which it's monetized, say in the UK at Premier League level. There's none of that. There was very little available for food and drink, not many other concessions in the stadium. So I think it's extremely hard for the clubs to even break even. But certainly Beijing Guoan have been very public in their aim to try and make it sustainable. And I think that's what China needs to do. It needs to be sustainable and grow it over time rather than what happened before, where tycoons put in hundreds of millions of dollars in order to try and shortcut it. You can't do that with football. It has to grow as a culture. And that's still probably the biggest challenge is to try and get people engaged in the game.
That does touch on the other thing that happened around the time of the corruption scandal was that for some of the reasons you mentioned, some of the investors also started pulling out or they were facing their own financial problems, particularly in the case of
Yeah.
some of the real estate companies as China's real
Yeah.
estate industry was clamped down on and went through this massive bust around the time of COVID. So we saw, for example, the collapse of Guangzhou Evergrande, funded by the Evergrande or Hengda real estate company, who went bankrupt, who had won the league for 7 years from 2011 to
Yeah.
17, who had won two Asian Champions Leagues. And the same with Jiangsu Suning, again invested by the Suning Electronics company, who
Yeah.
had that stake in Inter Milan, and they were closed down in 2021, the year after winning the league. So how much has all of that hit the confidence of fans? As you mentioned, there have always been some ultras, some really dedicated fans, and we'd hear about that in even more remote cities like Xi'an, where there were various football riots over the years because people were so impassioned. I mean, have fans just lost confidence in these big clubs, or are they still there? Presume it must have made fans pretty cynical.
Yeah, Chinese fans are great in that respect. I think the cynicism, and that does come out across social media a lot. So I think. if you're in Beijing, for example, Beijing Guan is the only club at that level, and it does represent the city. So people still have an interest in it. I think they're quite mercurial in how they look at the results. There's kind of a resignation that China's not great on the international scene. But I think if you look at the viewing figures, still Beijing Guoan in or local CSL matches will have higher viewership than international football matches do. So I think the fandom is still very strong. I mean, I saw the match against Shanghai, and certainly people were very vociferous in their hatred of Shanghai, and I think that's repeated the other way around. Both the Shanghai clubs, I think, when they come to Beijing, they get a quite a negative reaction and a welcome. Tianjin, Beijing also has a lot of rivalry. So, in China, there are not many places and times where you can vent your frustration or where you can shout and be a collective. And football's really one of the only places where that's still allowed. So if I look at the crowd at the recent Beijing match, I'm not sure how many of them are really true football fans. There seem to be a lot of young couples out there, enjoying the collective experience. So, there's really not many places in China where you get large groups of people who are all decked out in green in the Beijing Guoan. So I think there's a sort of a collective tribalism, which is still quite strong, and football's one of the only places where that can have a public airing. So I think it's probably more general than actually pure fandom. But having said that, there are certainly die-hard fans here who follow the team through thick and thin and get up off the floor and keep on going and keep on supporting. There's a really huge interest in football.
I was just going to say there's been also a lot of talk about this the Suchao, this Jiangsu province amateur league, which has
Yeah,
apparently garnered this huge amount of both domestic attendance but also interest online in the
yeah.
last couple of years. I mean, is that a symbol of people trying to get away from this very corrupt and sort of bloated type of league that they had in the past?
I think partly that's the case, but again, it's all about sort of regional pride and city pride. So I think some of the reporting, the international reporting, has kind of missed something there. I mean, it started with what they call the Tsunchao, the village super league in Guizhou, and I think for most people around the world, it's quite incredible. Sort of 150 years after football grew, China suddenly realized that there were villagers who liked playing football, and it became a sensation, and went viral, and led a massive tourism sort of charge. And I think the rest of China has now picked up on that, and they've realized that there is a lot of regional pride. I think, in some ways the jury's still out whether or not it can remain as an authentic amateur league. There's such a tendency here to bring in ringers to try and win the matches. But, it has increased popularity of the sport, and it has energized local audiences, and they've to get them behind their own team. I think it's interesting that a lot of these village or provincial super leagues, amateur super leagues that have been set up by local governments rather than the football associations. And I think that's something that they certainly have to learn, that regional identity is really important, and can, excite a lot of interest.
You mean the football associations need to learn this?
Yeah, they've been very focused on the professional China Super League and the two leagues below that. And then suddenly out of nowhere, we've got crowd sizes which are sometimes bigger than the CSL for amateur matches within local regions. So I think it's an eye opener for them to realize that football does start at a very, very hyper local basis, and it grows from there. And I think that's something that in a way worries the government about regional factionalism and whether that could, lead to protests on the streets. But it shows that football really is hyper local. All the regions in China are now trying to build the same type of local activities. So once again, it's shifted from perhaps what was originally authentic local work and now being taken over by government and being run from the top down, and that's probably the danger.
But I mean, from your point of view, presuming that it's a good thing if there are more people in more regions and at a sort of grassroots level getting involved in football? I mean, you have been very much promoting this for the last couple of decades with your involvement in club football, and you take training and sort of expertise to schools and to local clubs around the Beijing area. And your league is still going despite having, I think, been hit quite hard by COVID. So what are you seeing in terms of the level of interest from young people in China? Are they still as excited about football as kids all over the world?
Yeah, I think they are. I mean, it's interesting. I was talking to one of our coaches. All our coaches are UK coaches with UEFA qualifications, and they point out that if they're coaching in the UK, you can kind of take it for granted that kids are already into football. It comes from generations of engagement in the game, whereas in China, perhaps parents weren't involved in football. So you're starting from a much lower base. In one of our successful tricks, if you like, was the slogan "踢足球说英语," play football, speak English. And so back when we started, actually, it was another corruption period and China wasn't doing well internationally. So a lot of parents, particularly mums, were not too interested in their kids playing football. But learning English was definitely something that they all wanted. So we managed to encourage a lot of people to come to the football pitch with the opportunity to learn English. And then I think football takes over. So once the kids come to the game, come to training, and you've got decent, well-qualified coaches who know how to encourage the passion and the interest, the kids fall in love with it. And then it becomes part of their passion. So I always say in China, the most important stakeholders are the parents. So I think in the last 10 to 15 years, Chinese parents have embraced the idea that team sports, particularly football, can be a great educational opportunity for them. You learn about teamwork, you learn about winning and losing, obviously from the fitness point of view, but also psychologically and socially.
And how many people are involved in the league that you're involved in Beijing?
Within our coaching programs, we're in schools, but we're also out of schools in public parks and etc. I would think there's probably about 2,000 kids who are registered in our various programs. Our league that we set up has another 20 clubs who are also involved. So we have about, I think, 800 kids playing every week in that competition, about 80 or 90 teams. So it's still very small by sort of international standards, but it does grow. And when the kids come, very often we see parents who are so delighted that their kids have found something. I went along to a training session a few years ago and I saw a couple of parents on the touchline crying. And I thought initially, oh my God, what have we done? And I went across and spoke to them. And the reason they were crying is because they'd never seen their son so happy. And they were really upset that the school system had not provided an opportunity for their kids to be so joyous. And I think that's what we're starting to see. Chinese parents care so much about their kids' development, and more of them are now realizing that rather than a distraction from education, actually team sports are a very important part of education. And particularly so for parents who are looking at maybe sending their kids abroad for study later on. If they've been involved in a club here, when they arrive in the UK or other parts of the world, they can immediately join a club. And people in that club, they don't care who you are or what your background is. They want to know if you play in midfield or in defense or attack. So I think, yeah, Chinese parents are opening their minds to the benefits of team sports, as everyone else in the world already knows.
And how do you think this might affect, China's potential as a sort of soccer nation in the future? Do you think that this will one day translate into young Chinese players coming through in significant numbers and making China potentially the powerhouse that everyone has always said it could be or it should be given the numbers? We've seen in over the years a few Chinese players playing in Europe. We had Sun Xiang in Holland. You mentioned Li Tier, and obviously that
Mm.
didn't work out quite so well in the long run. But we had Manchester United at one point signed that young Chinese player called Dong Fangzhuo, who never
Yeah,
really played very much, although he did play on loan at other clubs. We've recently seen a young Chinese player called Li Haoyan, I believe, a 14-year-old joining the Barcelona
mm.
academy after playing in regional leagues in Spain. And I believe the Chinese under 17 team are doing quite well again now.
Yeah.
What do you feel about this? Is there a chance that despite all of the problems and the corruption, something stronger might grow out of the wreckage in the future?
I think it's a hard one, really. You know, the rest of the world is also developing. No one's standing still. The major football nations have got such a great base over literally over 100 years of development. So China still has to deal with that. I think you may see some individuals coming through. I mean, we've got two players who played with club football when they were young. One of them recently representing the under 23 team that reached the final of the Asian Championships.
The Chinese national under-23 team.
Yeah, so he's gone all the way from club football through to the under 23. So it shows it is possible. We have another young lad. His father Gong Lei was one of the better Chinese players who did play in Europe. He's just signed contracts with Auxerre in France. So I think, yeah, you will see a few more individuals coming through. Whether or not China can be a force in the World Cup, I think it's a very, very long road. And as I say, the rest of the countries are not standing still. I think it's also interesting to note that the Chinese women's team, I think, is on a downward trajectory. If you go back to sort of the beginnings of women's football in the early 90s, China was right at the top, getting to World Cup finals. I think in the last World Cup we saw that fall away, and that's very much as a result of Europe, I guess, embracing women's football. I mean, for so long, women were excluded from the game, and now the big Premier League clubs have all got women's teams. And so we're seeing a massive increase, an exponential increase in participation and in the performance levels. Whereas in China, unfortunately, the men's game has very little to offer the women. So I think you're going to see a decline in the women's performance. You know, once I was interviewed by a foreign journalist and they asked me whether or not China would win the World Cup by 2050. My response was, well, if China wins the World Cup by 2050, I will eat a football. And it went kind of viral on social media here, with a lot of people pointing out that I probably won't still be alive by 2050, but a lot more who are saying, you know, if China wins the World Cup, I'll eat 500 footballs and a pair of goalkeeper gloves. So I think it's a lot to imagine that China will ever win a World Cup. I mean, there are so many great football nations who've never won it. I think what China's ambition should be is to build the grassroots pyramid where tens of millions of kids are enjoying the game, becoming fitter, becoming better citizens as a result, rather than look for results in international competition. So I think it's a long road.
And is the official backing still there in any significant way? You know, as we say, the government had talked about its dream of hosting a World Cup, for example, if not winning it. But there does seem to be some suggestion that perhaps that's not so high on, for example, Xi Jinping's priorities as he focuses on things like technological self-reliance or dealing with economic issues or consumer problems, whether they see football as something that can boost consumption. You suggested that it's not been as marketized as it might have been, is also a question, I guess. But is that kind of political will still there, or has the government really lost interest? You know, we were told that Xi Jinping was a major football fan. He apparently discussed football with Prince William when he visited China in 2015. And then when Xi Jinping came to Britain on a state visit the same year, I believe he went to Manchester City, and we had Sun Jihai, one of the Chinese
Yeah,
players, was
yeah,
inducted into the British Football Hall of Fame. So, you know, it looked like this was a major plank, perhaps even of
yeah.
diplomacy, but that doesn't seem to be there at the moment.
No, I think that's right. I mean, he gave it a damn good go, I have to say that. And the football reform plans, as I say, laid out a very sensible route for China to take in football, which was manipulated perhaps by moneyed interests for other reasons. So I do believe he is a football fan, that he still wishes the best for Chinese football, but certainly we don't see the kind of political imperative to invest in the game anymore. We mentioned the Sun Chao and the sort of Su Chao and these sort of regional government-led initiatives. I think that's probably a more sustainable way. So that certainly increases consumption in the game and then brings the game much closer to local people. I mean, quite strange. The kind of national policies for football has gone away. And I think in a way that gives football a more reasonable opportunity to develop in a sustainable way. So I think around the world, you know, I mean, no government has enough money to invest in football. It does require a lot of volunteerism at the local level. and a lot of passionate interest and support from people who get nothing back. Of course, if there are one or two Chinese players who come through to prominence internationally, that will have a big impact on exciting kids to get involved. So I think it's much more realistic now. What happened before was a crazy, crazy experiment. I think probably more money was wasted during that period than ever in the history of sport anywhere in the world. None of it went to the right places, so we didn't see a massive improvement, with the exception of building more pitches. And now we're relying on a new generation who just see the benefits of sport that the rest of the world kind of cottoned on to 100 years ago. That's what China needs to do. There are no short-term fixes. You can't build it from the top down. It has to come from the bottom up.
And what about the role of international clubs and organizations, many of whom did at some point open academies in China or open their own junior clubs? What impact did that have, and what legacy has that left?
So I do have a bit of a bee in my bonnet about the failure of the international football world to push through to China that football has to start at the grassroots and grow from there, and you can't build it from the top down. I mean, since COVID, we haven't had too much, but during that golden yuan era, we saw lots of foreign clubs coming in and sort of setting up junior coaching programs which sort of compete against us, but with the big brand names. So I do think that some of the issues in Chinese football, some responsibility does lie on the big international clubs who came to China and threw away their own morals. Basically, it's extremely hard to run football at grassroots level in China. It's not a big money spinner. So a lot of these clubs took franchise fees. We're hearing stories of $200,000, $400,000 a year to be able to use the brand name. And so moneyed individuals were prepared to pay that franchise fee and then unable to sustain it because you're $200,000 down before a single child has signed up. So they came in, took the money for the franchise fee, which looks good on their balance sheet, but then the local partners were unable to deliver over a longer period. So more or less, most of these have now failed. I mean, the number of clubs that had junior operations in China who no longer have junior operations, I mean, it's pretty much all of them.
And how about the fans of the national team? They've seen them fall to some pretty humiliating results, losing 7-0 to Japan and losing to Indonesia in their last World Cup qualifying campaign. Chinese fans have often been very angry and, even publicly demonstrated on the streets after some ignominious failures, I think being knocked out before the 1998 World Cup to one of the Gulf states, which had a population that was something like, 1/10,000th of China's. I can't remember the exact number. But,
Yeah.
Are fans still willing to back the national team, or are they just completely cynical about it and its chances of actually qualifying for a World Cup?
I think it's both, and I think actually that's the same as fans around the world, isn't it? I mean, yeah, I can certainly remember times when the England fans were very much against the team, but as soon as you have a good result or two, everyone's back on board. Recently the under-23 team reached the final, and people put their hopes on that. The under-17 team you mentioned haven't done badly, so China's always looking for the opportunity to have, positive joy at the team doing well. So I don't think that ever goes away, even though. For a long time, we've had very poor results. Such is the passion that whenever there's an opportunity and something goes well, people will grab on it and there will be joy in the streets. So I think in that respect, China's the same as anywhere else. When things go badly, you shout and scream, and then suddenly you get a win or two and everything looks rosy. So that is what football can do. It unites people like nothing else.
Well, Rowan Simons, thank you so much for joining us on China in Context.
Thank you very much.
That's all we have time for on this episode. You can find out more about SOAS China Institute events and read our blog articles on our website soas.ac.uk. For now, thanks for listening and goodbye.